Stella, you're not invited. Don't argue. You'd embarrass the family just by showing up. My mother's words cut through the phone line with surgical precision, each syllable designed to remind me of my place in the Taylor family hierarchy, which was apparently nowhere at all. I'd been scrolling through Instagram, watching cousins post about bridesmaid dresses and bachelor parties, aunts sharing photos of wedding planning committees I hadn't known existed. Everyone was buzzing about Rachel's wedding, the event of the year for a family that treated celebrations like exclusive memberships where some people simply didn't qualify. The navy dress hanging in my closet mocked me through its plastic dry cleaning bag. $200 I'd saved from working overtime shifts at the hospital, bought specifically for the ceremony where I'd planned to prove that the family screw-up had finally gotten her life together. Not forgotten, I whispered to myself after hanging up, the dial tone echoing like a funeral bell. Erased. But as I stared at that dress, evidence of hope that had been deemed inappropriate for family consumption, something crystallized in my chest that felt nothing like defeat. You'll regret the day you told me I wasn't worth a seat at the table. My name is Stella Taylor. I'm 34 years old, and to my family, I was always the mistake child, too loud when they wanted quiet, too messy when they demanded perfection, too wrong for their carefully curated family photograph that hung in the hallway like evidence of everything I'd never learned to be. The Taylor family operated on unspoken rules that everyone seemed to understand except me. There was a way to laugh that didn't draw attention, a way to sit that took up minimal space, a way to exist that required constant apologies for breathing too loudly, or wanting too much, or simply being present when presence wasn't requested. Growing up in our colonial house in Westchester, I learned early that family dinners were performances where I consistently forgot my lines. My laugh, which friends at school called infectious, was met with sharp glares across our mahogany dining table. My stories about school were interrupted with sighs that suggested I was taking up time better spent on more important family members' achievements. The seating arrangement told the story better than words ever could. My father at the head, my mother to his right, my cousin Rachel, who lived with us after her parents divorced, positioned like a daughter they'd actually chosen. My chair was consistently shoved to the far end, close enough to be included but distant enough to remember that inclusion had limits. During holidays, the dynamic became even more pronounced. Thanksgiving dinners where Rachel's college applications were discussed with pride while my community college courses were mentioned in whispers, as if higher education from state schools was a family secret that shouldn't be shared with guests. Christmas mornings where her gifts were opened with ceremony while mine were tucked into corners like afterthoughts. The memory that still burns like acid in my throat happened when I was 12, during Easter service at St. Matthew's. I'd been fidgeting in the wooden pew, uncomfortable in the dress my mother had chosen because it was on sale, not because it fit properly, when she leaned close and hissed words that branded themselves into my nervous system. "Stop squirming. You're humiliating me," she whispered, her fingernails digging into my arm with pressure that left crescent-shaped marks on my skin. The pain was sharp and immediate, but the shame that followed was deeper and more lasting. Even now, 22 years later, my skin remembers the sting of her nails and the lesson they were meant to teach. My natural behavior was inherently embarrassing to people who had to claim me as family. Rachel, meanwhile, sat perfectly still beside us, her posture straight as a cathedral spire, her hands folded in her lap with the kind of natural grace that my mother praised in voices loud enough for other parishioners to hear. "Such a well-behaved child," she'd say, words that were compliments for Rachel and indictments for me, delivered in the same breath. The golden child syndrome was textbook in our household. Rachel was draped in praise like expensive jewelry, her grades, her friends, her future plans discussed with the kind of pride usually reserved for family heirlooms being passed down through generations. She was going to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever she decided because her potential was limitless and her character was unquestionable. I was the shadow at every family gathering, tolerated but never celebrated, included in group photos but positioned at edges where cropping could remove me if necessary. My achievements, making honor roll at community college, getting promoted at the hospital where I worked as a pharmacy technician, buying my own car with money I'd saved, were acknowledged with nods that felt more like dismissals than recognition. The strange thing about being the family scapegoat is that you internalize the role so completely that you start believing you deserve it. For years I told myself that my mother's criticism was constructive, that Rachel's favored status was earned through superior behavior I could learn to emulate if I just tried harder. I thought that growing up would change the dynamic, that reaching milestones would prove my worthiness, that professional success would translate into family respect, that time would heal wounds that had been carved so deep they'd become part of my identity. When Rachel announced her engagement 18 months ago, I genuinely believed this would be my chance to finally belong. Weddings were supposed to be about family unity, about bringing everyone together to celebrate love and commitment and the continuation of family traditions. I imagined being included in planning sessions, maybe asked to help with decorations or give a speech about growing up together. Instead, I learned through Instagram posts and overheard phone conversations that there were bridesmaid selections I hadn't been considered for, bachelorette parties I hadn't been invited to, family meetings about wedding logistics that happened without my knowledge. But I told myself that was normal. Not everyone could be a bridesmaid. Not every cousin needed to be involved in every planning detail. The important thing was the wedding itself, the ceremony where our family would gather, and I'd finally have a seat at the table that mattered, literally and metaphorically. I'd even bought a dress. Navy blue, conservative enough to show respect for the occasion but elegant enough to announce that I'd grown into someone worthy of inclusion. $200 I'd saved from working overtime shifts at the hospital, money that represented faith in a future where my presence would be welcomed rather than endured. The phone call from my mother shattered that faith with surgical precision. "Stella, you're not invited. Don't argue. You'd embarrass the family just by showing up. Not forgotten, not overlooked due to limited seating, not excluded because of some logistical oversight that could be corrected with a conversation. Erased. Deliberately. Permanently." The realization that bloodlines don't guarantee belonging hit me with the force of truth that can no longer be avoided. Family isn't determined by genetics or shared histories or legal documents that prove kinship. Family is determined by choice, and my family had chosen to celebrate their most important moment without me. Sitting in my apartment after that phone call, staring at the navy dress hanging in my closet like evidence of hope that had been deemed inappropriate for family consumption, I understood for the first time that the problem had never been my behavior or my achievements or my inability to meet their standards. The problem was that they had never wanted me to succeed in meeting their standards because my role in their family dynamic required me to fail. Rachel couldn't be the golden child without me being the disappointment. My mother couldn't feel superior without someone to feel superior to. The family photograph couldn't be perfect if everyone in it was worthy of being there. I had been cast in a role I'd never auditioned for and spent 34 years trying to rewrite a script that was never meant to change. But scripts can be rewritten by people brave enough to walk away from productions that don't value their contribution. The dress was still beautiful, still elegant, still proof that I had good taste and financial discipline and the kind of hope that survives decades of discouragement. But it would never hang in the closet of someone who begged for invitations to events where her presence was considered embarrassing. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone who was about to discover that the most important celebrations happen when you finally stop waiting for other people's permission to celebrate yourself. The psychological warfare started 4 months before Rebecca's wedding, delivered in perfectly curated Instagram posts that felt like targeted missiles aimed directly at my heart. My phone became a torture device, buzzing with notifications that I couldn't stop myself from opening even though I knew each one would draw blood. Rebecca's engagement brunch, 23 family members toasting with mimosas in crystal flutes I'd never held. The bridesmaids' shopping trip, all blush pink dresses and matching manicures, captioned squad goals with my favorite girls. Aunt Margaret's bridal shower, where my own grandmother smiled beside towers of Tiffany boxes I'd never been invited to help unwrap. Each post was surgical in its precision. The kind of exclusion that looks accidental to outsiders but feels intentional to the one person who's been systematically erased from every family celebration since she learned to walk. I worked double shifts at the nonprofit in Brooklyn, processing grant applications for homeless shelters, while watching my family plan a celebration I'd never be part of. My cramped desk overlooked a parking lot where pigeons fought over McDonald's scraps, and somehow that felt like the perfect metaphor for my relationship with the Thomas family tree. But I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that maybe wedding planning was just overwhelming, that maybe Rebecca would call soon, apologetic about the delay, asking me to be part of something, anything, even if it was just addressing envelopes or picking up flowers. The weeks crawled by with the pace of water torture, each day bringing new evidence that I was living in a parallel universe where my family existed without acknowledging my existence. Then came the group text that shattered every last delusion I'd been clinging to, like a life raft in shark-infested waters. I was on the subway heading home from another soul-crushing day of grant rejections when my phone lit up with a notification from Thomas' family wedding updates, a group chat I'd somehow been added to months ago, probably by accident when someone was creating the guest list. The message was from my mother, sent at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Don't forget, rehearsal dinner tomorrow at Romano's, 7 p.m. sharp. Can't wait to celebrate our beautiful Rebecca. 22 people responded within minutes. Heart emojis flooding the screen like confetti at a parade I wasn't invited to watch. So excited, and can't wait, and love you, Becca, cascading down my phone screen like evidence of my own irrelevance. I scrolled up through weeks of messages I'd never seen, detailed discussions about centerpieces, transportation arrangements, who was bringing cameras to capture memories I'd never be part of creating. My family had been planning this wedding like a military operation, and I was the civilian casualty they'd written off without a second thought. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold my phone as I called my mother from the subway platform at Atlantic Avenue, surrounded by commuters rushing home to families who actually wanted them there. Mom. My voice came out smaller than I'd intended, like I was 13 again, asking permission to exist in my own family. The rehearsal dinner text, I think there might have been a mistake with the invitations. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 4 seconds, long enough for a train to rumble past, long enough for my heart to stop beating. Long enough for me to realize I'd just asked the question that would change everything. Paisley. She said my name like it tasted bad in her mouth. Like saying it out loud was a reminder of a mistake she'd been trying to forget for 34 years. You're not invited. The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually staggered backward, bumping into a businessman who muttered something about watching where I was going. The subway platform spun around me like I was drunk, but I hadn't had anything stronger than coffee in weeks. What do you mean I'm not invited? It's Rebecca's wedding. We're family. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Her voice dropped to that familiar whisper of controlled fury I remembered from childhood, the one that preceded the worst punishments. You make people uncomfortable, Paisley. It's Rebecca's day. Don't ruin it by showing up where you clearly don't belong. The line went dead with a click that echoed in my ear like a gunshot. I stood there on that subway platform, holding my phone like it might explode, watching trains arrive and depart while commuters flowed around me like water around a stone. The city moved at its relentless pace while I remained frozen in the moment when my mother had finally said out loud what I'd suspected my entire life. I was an embarrassment to be managed, not a daughter to be loved. That night, I stood in my Brooklyn studio apartment, staring at the navy dress hanging on my closet door like a monument to my own stupidity. The plastic dry cleaner's bag crinkled as I pushed it deeper into the corner, behind winter coats I'd bought at thrift stores and shoes I'd resoled twice because I couldn't afford new ones. The sound was like a coffin lid closing, final, irreversible, sealing away the last hope I'd harbored about earning my place at their table, through sheer determination and the right outfit. $300 I'd charged to a credit card that was already maxed out, $300 for a dress I'd bought to prove I was worthy of celebrating love with people who'd never shown me any. I thought about Rebecca, probably getting her final dress fitting, surrounded by bridesmaids who'd known about this wedding longer than I had. I thought about my mother, probably relieved that she'd finally found a foolproof way to eliminate the family problem without having to actually disown me. I thought about 34 years of trying to earn my place in a family that had never made room for who I actually was. But as I stood there in the dark, something began to crystallize in my chest like ice forming around a fire that refused to be extinguished. They thought they could erase me, write me out of the family story like I'd never existed. Eliminate the inconvenient reminder that their perfect portrait had always included someone who didn't match their carefully curated image. They had no idea what they'd just unleashed. Saturday, September 21st, 3:15 in the afternoon. The exact moment Rebecca Thomas was walking down the aisle to become Rebecca Montgomery, surrounded by every person who'd ever mattered in our family, every person except me. I knew the precise timing because my phone had transformed into an instrument of psychological torture, buzzing every few minutes with Instagram stories and Facebook Live videos from relatives who'd either forgotten I could see their posts or remembered and decided this was just another opportunity to remind me of my place in the family. Hierarchy. The first notification arrived at 3:23 p.m. My cousin Sarah's Instagram story. A shaky video of Rebecca in her dress. Ivory silk that probably cost more than I made in 3 months, catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows of St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue. The audio was muffled by wind and traffic, but I could hear the string quartet, the rustle of expensive fabric, the collective gasp of approval that comes when a bride appears. I was sitting on the hardwood floor of my Brooklyn studio apartment when I watched it, back pressed against my IKEA couch that I'd assembled with a screwdriver and sheer determination. Knees drawn up to my chest like I was trying to compress myself small enough to disappear entirely. My blackout curtains were drawn tight against the September sunshine, casting everything in the kind of gray shadows that matched the hollow ache expanding in my ribcage, like a tumor made of rejection. The radiator clanked in the corner, a rhythmic metal on metal percussion that sounded like a countdown timer. The refrigerator hummed its constant electric drone, loud enough to fill the silence but not loud enough to drown out the sound of my own breathing in an apartment that suddenly felt like a tomb. Another buzz. This time it was Aunt Margaret, posting a picture from inside the cathedral. 7 bridesmaids in dusty rows, 7 groomsmen in charcoal gray, Rebecca glowing at the center like she'd been lit by professional photographers. The caption read, "Our princess, on her perfect day. Number Thomas family love number forever Montgomery." I counted faces I recognized. My mother in the front row, wearing the burgundy dress she'd shown me pictures of 6 months ago, when I'd still believed I'd be sitting beside her. My grandmother, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief I'd given her for her 80th birthday. Uncle David, Aunt Carol, cousins I'd grown up with. Family friends who'd watched me stumble through childhood piano recitals and middle school graduation ceremonies. All of them there. All of them celebrating. All of them existing in a moment I'd been surgically removed from like a cancerous growth they needed to excise for the health of the whole organism. My phone buzzed again. A video this time, posted by my cousin Mark's new wife. The camera panned across the reception hall at the Plaza Hotel. White roses and gold accents, crystal chandeliers that threw rainbows across tablecloths that cost more per yard than my monthly Metro card. The audio captured laughter, conversation, the clink of champagne flutes against china that had probably been selected by wedding planners who charged more per hour than I made in a week. I could hear my mother's voice in the background of that video, telling someone about Rebecca's dress, how she'd helped choose it, how proud she was of her beautiful niece on her special day. The same warm maternal tone she'd used when she told me I made people uncomfortable, loving when it served her narrative. Ice cold when I threatened the story she'd written about who deserved affection and who deserved exile. Every notification was a scalpel, precise and deliberate. This wasn't oversight. Oversight implies accident, implies someone forgetting to include you by mistake. This was architectural exclusion. They had blueprinted this celebration around my absence, designed every element to function perfectly without the complication of my presence. The cruelest part wasn't even missing the wedding itself. It was watching my family's joy unfold in real time, seeing proof that their happiness was not diminished by my absence. It was enhanced by it. Their celebration was perfect precisely because I wasn't there to ruin it with my existence. I don't exist to them. The thought hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over on that apartment floor. After 34 years of believing that blood meant something, that family was supposed to be the one place where belonging wasn't conditional, I finally understood the truth that had been staring me in the face since childhood. I had never been family to them. I had been a problem to be managed, a complication to be contained, an embarrassment to be hidden until they could find a way to eliminate me entirely, without the messy confrontation of actually disowning me. But here's the part that twisted the knife deepest. I could feel every second of their joy like it was my own pain. Every laugh captured in those videos echoed in my empty apartment like mockery. Every smile in those photos reminded me that their contentment was complete without me, that their family portrait was more beautiful with the awkward daughter cropped out of frame. The rejection wasn't just about missing a party. It was about being told, in the most public way possible, that my family's love had always been conditional, that I had failed some test I'd never known I was taking, that after 3 decades of trying to earn my place at their table, I had been found fundamentally wanting and discarded like yesterday's newspaper. As the afternoon stretched into evening and the notifications kept coming, the father-daughter dance I'd never have, the cake-cutting ceremony I'd never witness, the toasts celebrating a family bond I'd never be part of, I realized something was crystallizing in the hollow space where my heart used to beat. The radiator clanked its metal rhythm. The refrigerator hummed its electric lullaby. Outside my window, Brooklyn moved at its relentless pace while I sat motionless in the wreckage of my own naive expectations. They thought they had solved their Paisley problem by making me disappear, by writing me out of the family story without having to face the ugliness of what they were actually doing, by celebrating love while demonstrating the precise opposite to the one person who'd spent her entire life trying to earn theirs. But you can't erase someone by pretending they don't exist. You can only teach them that their worth isn't determined by your acceptance. You can only show them that their happiness doesn't depend on your inclusion. I stared at my phone screen, watching my family toast to forever while I sat alone in an apartment I could barely afford, and felt something shift in my chest like tectonic plates rearranging themselves before an earthquake. They wanted me gone from their perfect family portrait. They were about to learn that some people, when pushed far enough into the shadows, don't disappear quietly. They ignite. The candle I lit that night wasn't for ceremony or comfort. It was because I couldn't bear to see my apartment under the harsh glare of overhead lights, the stack of overdue bills on my counter, the wedding gift I'd bought for Rebecca still wrapped in silver paper, the life I'd been living while pretending I mattered to people who'd just proven I was less than nothing to them. The flame flickered against my kitchen wall, casting shadows that danced like ghosts of every family dinner I'd never be invited to again. The wax pooled slowly, methodically, like time moving forward while I sat frozen in the aftermath of my own systematic erasure. My phone lay face down on the counter, finally silent after hours of wedding updates that had cut me deeper than any deliberate cruelty could have. Just silence, and the smell of vanilla wax, and the sound of my neighbors' Saturday night through paper-thin walls, laughter and music, and the sounds of people who belonged somewhere. But I couldn't stop myself from looking one more time. I picked up that phone like I was handling evidence from a crime scene, knowing it would destroy me but unable to resist the magnetic pull of my own annihilation. The wedding photographer had already uploaded the professional shots. Rebecca radiant in ivory silk, surrounded by faces I'd known my entire life, all of them glowing with the kind of genuine happiness I'd never inspired in any of them. There was my mother, elegant in burgundy, her arm around Rebecca during what must have been the mother-niece dance. Her face held an expression I'd spent 34 years trying to earn, pure, unguarded love. Pride so genuine it radiated through the camera lens like heat from a fire I'd never been allowed to warm myself by. That's when the truth hit me like a wrecking ball to the chest. This wasn't oversight. This wasn't Rebecca being overwhelmed with wedding planning or my mother being thoughtless about guest lists. This was deliberate exile, executed with surgical precision by people who'd spent decades perfecting the art of making me feel unwanted without having to actually say the words out loud. I scrolled deeper into the photos, each one a knife twist perfectly calibrated to cause maximum damage. My grandmother, who'd helped raise me during those summers when my mother needed a break from parenting, beaming as she held Rebecca's bouquet. My Uncle Richard, who used to sneak me extra dessert at family dinners, laughing at some joke I'd never hear. Cousins who'd borrowed my homework, slept in my bedroom during sleepovers, eaten at my table when their parents were fighting, all of them celebrating in a space I'd been forbidden to enter. The navy dress hung in my closet like a monument to my own delusion, its plastic dry cleaner's bag catching the hallway light like a shroud over everything I'd hoped to become. $300 charged to a credit card I couldn't afford to pay off. $300 for fabric that would never see the celebration it was bought for, that would hang in my closet like a headstone marking the grave of my last hope about belonging somewhere. My phone hadn't rung once since the wedding ended. Not a single text message asking where I was. No voicemail wondering why I hadn't shown up. My absence had been so perfectly planned that no one even had to pretend to notice it. They'd organized their celebration around my non-existence, and it had gone off without a hitch because I'd never been part of the equation in the first place. I caught my reflection in the black screen of my phone. Mascara streaked down my cheeks like war paint, hair disheveled from running my hands through it, eyes swollen from crying over people who would never shed a tear over losing me. I looked destroyed, broken, exactly like they'd probably intended me to look. But underneath the wreckage, something else was stirring. Something harder than heartbreak, sharper than disappointment, more dangerous than the despair that had been eating me alive for the past 6 hours. I stood up from that kitchen counter, the candle flame casting my shadow tall against the wall, and spoke into the darkness with a voice I'd never heard come out of my throat, steady, cold, absolutely final. If they don't want me, I'll go where I am wanted. The words hung in the air like a declaration of independence from people who'd never deserved the power I'd given them over my sense of worth. Like a vow made to the woman I'd been, before I started believing that their approval was necessary for my existence. If they cut me out, I'll write myself back in. Because standing there in my Brooklyn apartment, surrounded by shadows and the scent of vanilla wax and the sound of my own breathing in a space that suddenly felt less like a tomb and more like a launch pad, I realized something that 34 years of trying to earn their love had never taught me. You can't erase someone by pretending they don't exist. You can only teach them that their worth isn't determined by your recognition. You can only show them that their happiness doesn't require your permission. They'd spent decades training me to beg for scraps of their affection, to accept being treated as a burden they had to carry, to believe that being tolerated was the same thing as being loved. They'd groomed me to be grateful for whatever corner they'd allow me to occupy in their family portrait, to never ask for more than they were willing to give, to shrink myself small enough to fit into whatever space they designated as appropriate for someone like me. But rejection has a funny way of clarifying things. When you're forced to exist without people you thought you needed, you discover reserves of strength you never knew you possessed. When you're expelled from spaces you thought defined you, you realize you were never actually welcome there in the first place. You were just too afraid to admit it. The candle burned lower, wax pooling into shapes that looked like possibilities instead of endings. Outside my window, Brooklyn hummed with its Saturday night energy, sirens and car horns and the sound of people living their lives without permission from anyone. The city that had taught me that belonging isn't something you're born into, it's something you create. My phone buzzed one final time. A late-night Instagram story from Rebecca herself, a selfie with her new husband, both of them glowing with champagne and new marriage bliss, captioned, "Perfect day with perfect family." I looked at that photo for exactly 3 seconds, then opened my phone settings and unfollowed every single family member whose posts had been torturing me for months. Unfriended, blocked, deleted their numbers from my contacts like I was performing surgery on my own life, cutting away the infected tissue that had been poisoning my bloodstream for decades. Standing in my apartment that night, surrounded by candlelight and silence and the lingering scent of my own transformation, I felt something crystallize in my chest, like steel forming in a forge. They thought they had solved their Paisley problem by making me disappear from their celebration. By writing me out of the family story without having to face the ugliness of what they were actually doing. By proving that their happiness was not only possible without me, but enhanced by my absence. What they'd actually done was set me free from the prison of caring what they thought about me. They'd liberated me from the exhausting work of trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. They'd handed me the gift of my own life back, a life that didn't require their approval to be worth living. The woman who'd been told she was too embarrassing to attend her own cousin's wedding was about to show them exactly how much of an embarrassment she could become when she stopped trying to make them comfortable and started making herself free. They'd cut me out of their story. Now it was time to write my own. The emerald dress came out of that closet 3 days later, not as a symbol of rejection, but as armor for my own revolution. I pulled it from behind the winter coats where I'd buried it like evidence of my own foolishness, and this time when I held it up to the light, I saw something different. Not the desperate hope of a woman begging for acceptance, but the battle flag of someone who'd finally learned the difference between belonging and begging. They don't define me, they never did. The words echoed in my apartment as I folded that dress into a suitcase I hadn't used since my honeymoon 7 years ago. Same dress, different woman, same fabric, completely different story. I will not sit in the ruins of their rejection. I'll rise into the sunlight of my own choosing. My best friend Maya answered on the second ring when I called her at midnight, my voice steady for the first time in weeks. "Remember that girls' trip to Miami we talked about last year?" I said, zipping up the suitcase that contained everything I needed to prove I didn't need them. "How fast can you pack?" 24 hours later, I was boarding a Southwest flight with Maya and Jessica, 2 women who'd known me since college, who'd watched me shrink myself for a family that had never deserved the effort. They didn't ask questions when I'd called them in the middle of the night. They just said yes, booked their tickets, and showed up with mimosas and travel cups and the kind of fierce loyalty that real family actually looks like. Miami's skyline rose from the ocean like a promise kept. All glass and steel and possibility stretching toward a sun that felt like it was shining specifically for people who decided to stop apologizing for taking up space. The plane descended over turquoise water that sparkled like scattered diamonds, and for the first time in 34 years, I felt like I was flying towards something instead of running away. Our hotel room had a balcony that overlooked South Beach, where palm trees swayed against a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. The air smelled like salt and sunscreen, and the kind of freedom that comes when you realize you've been living in a prison of other people's expectations. "So," Maya said, unpacking her suitcase with the efficiency of someone who'd traveled the world instead of spending her life trying to earn her mother's approval, "what's the plan?" I pulled out the emerald dress, shaking out wrinkles that had formed during our flight. The silk caught the afternoon light streaming through our hotel window, shimmering like water, like possibility, like proof that sometimes the best revenge is refusing to stay broken. "We're going to celebrate," I said, my voice carrying a certainty I'd never heard from myself before. "We're going to dinner. We're going to dance. And I'm going to wear this dress the way it was meant to be worn, by someone who knows she deserves to be seen." That evening, as the Miami sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, I stood on South Beach wearing $200 worth of silk that had once represented my desperation to belong somewhere I was never wanted. Now it felt like a second skin, like armor made of self-respect and the kind of confidence that comes from choosing your own celebration instead of begging for invitations to someone else's. Maya snapped photos of me twirling in the surf, my bare feet sinking into sand that was warm and soft and real, nothing like the cold marble floors of venues where I'd never been welcome. Jessica popped a bottle of champagne that cost $12 at the hotel gift shop, and it tasted better than any toast I'd never been invited to make. "You look radiant," Maya said, holding up her phone to capture me laughing as waves lapped at the hem of my dress. "Like yourself, but more. More. Not less, like I'd always been told. Not too much, like I'd always been made to feel. More, like someone who'd finally learned that belonging isn't granted by other people's approval. It's chosen. It's created. It's built by people who see your worth and reflect it back to you until you can see it yourself." The Miami skyline glittered behind us as the sun sank toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold that made my emerald dress look like it had been designed specifically for this moment. Not for their wedding. For my awakening. My phone buzzed with a notification. Another Instagram story from the wedding I'd been excluded from. Probably someone posting late photos of the reception I'd spent months imagining myself attending. I looked at the notification for exactly 3 seconds, then slipped the phone back into my purse without opening it. They said I'd embarrass them just by showing up. But shame only lives where you accept it, and I was done accepting anything from people who'd never offered me anything real in the first place. Standing in Miami surf at sunset, barefoot and laughing, surrounded by women who dropped everything to celebrate my liberation, I realized something that 34 years of trying to earn my family's love had never taught me. Family isn't who shuts the door on you. It's who dances with you under a sky that's yours alone. The waves crashed around my ankles, the champagne bubbles tickled my nose, and somewhere 3,000 miles away, people who'd written me out of their story were probably posting their last wedding photos of the night. But I wasn't watching anymore. I was too busy shining under a Miami sky that belonged to me, wearing a dress that had been transformed from symbol of rejection into proof that sometimes the best celebrations are the ones you throw for yourself. No longer erased. Finally, brilliantly, unapologetically alive. If Stella's story hit you right in the chest, if you've ever been told you weren't good enough for someone else's table, if you've ever had to choose between begging for acceptance or building your own celebration, you're not alone. Hit that like button if you've ever had to create your own version of family. Subscribe and turn on notifications because next week, we're diving into another story about someone who refused to stay small in spaces that were never meant to hold them. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that being excluded from the wrong table just means you're free to find the right one. Comment below and tell me about a time you chose yourself over people who didn't choose you, because those stories matter. And they remind all of us that sometimes the best revenge is living so well that their rejection becomes irrelevant. Remember, you don't need permission to celebrate your own life. You don't need an invitation to know your own worth. And you definitely don't need approval from people who see your existence as an inconvenience.